So here we'll be looking at J.S. Bach's Partita No. 1 in B-flat major. Specifically, we'll be looking at measures 32 through 40 of the Gigue. Now in this passage, we have a series of diminished seventh chords. And this type of series isn't exactly common within Baroque music. There's two different ways that we can look at this pattern. The first way is chromatically, and the second way is by looking at it in relation to the circle of fifths. But before we dive into these two different ways of analyzing this passage, let's look at what makes up diminished seventh chords and the limitations that we find when building diminished seventh chords. So here we have the only 3 diminished seventh chords that exist. And you might be thinking, well, aren't there 12 different notes that we can build diminished seventh chords on? And that's true, but in this case, we really only need the notes that are here in these 3 chords. And by rearranging them in different inversions, we can create all the diminished seventh chords that do exist. So for example, in this first chord, we have a C diminished seventh chord. But if we simply take these same 4 notes and build them with the E flat as the starting note, we get an E flat diminished seventh chord, without changing any of the notes that are there, but simply just respelling them enharmonically. So now that we've established that, let's take a look at this passage specifically. So the first way that we can analyze this passage is by looking at it chromatically. And we see here that this line of diminished seventh chords starts out with 3 chords all based on the root note of F. And this pedal tone F, if you would call it that, helps set up the rest of this series of diminished seventh chords by giving us this common foundation before changing all the notes. So in this section here, we have our F major chord followed by an F dominant seventh chord followed by an F diminished seventh chord. And this is our transitional phrase that sets up our series of diminished seventh chords. Now as we look at these chords that follow, we can see that each of the root notes descend by a half step each time that a chord is introduced. So we begin with an F diminished seventh chord, and this is followed by an E diminished seventh chord, which is followed by an E flat diminished seventh chord, and the pattern continues all the way down until the end. So then we have our D diminished seventh chord, our D flat diminished seventh chord, our C diminished seventh chord, and then finally a repetition of the D flat at the end. Now we can look at these chords based on how these stars mark them. So in this case, the stars note a new chord. And when we look at it that way, we see that we only have 3 different chords here, which matches up with what we talked about previously regarding the limitations with diminished seventh chords. So these red stars marking F diminished seventh chord and D diminished seventh chord are both the same notes. If we simply rearrange them, there's no different notes between them, they're just spelled enharmonically different. And our green stars mark our E diminished seventh chord and our D flat diminished seventh chord, and we can see that the same notes are present there as well, with our E, our G, our B flat, and our D flat. And then finally, our blue stars mark our E flat diminished seventh chord and our C diminished seventh chord, and those also share the same notes. Now that we've established that, let's move on to the second way that we can look at this sequence of diminished seventh chords. The second way that we can look at this passage is by comparing it to the circle of fifths. So when we do that, we see that we still start out with our F chord, our F major chord, and our F dominant seventh chord. But after this, we can reinterpret these chords to be based on different notes, and by doing this, we can create a whole different pattern without changing any of the notes. So as we see here, it starts with a B diminished seventh chord, followed by an E diminished seventh chord. And this is a distance of a fifth. And this passage, or this pattern, continues throughout this whole series. So the E is followed by an A, the A is followed by a D, and so on. And each of these chords are separated by the distance of a fifth. So this is an interesting point to note because we didn't change any of the notes, yet we created a whole different pattern within this series. And when we look at it from a broader perspective, we can see that J.S. Bach used these chords in a way that wasn't common within the Baroque genre. A series of diminished seventh chords isn't exactly a popular chord progression, but yet he weaves it in this passage by using triplets and by letting each chord flow to the next, similar to a waterfall effect, so that they don't sound disjointed or out of place. So with that said, let's take a listen to what this piece sounds like in context.